This video demonstrates Richard Lanham's Paramedic method, a strategy for editing your writing so it is clearer and more concise. This video is designed to tie into how my classes approach this concept, though you shouldn't have to be my student in order to understand the video. Before we start talking about the Paramedic method, I want to bring up some important principles and disclaimers linked to using it. First, the Paramedic method is an editing strategy, so you make sure your ideas are developed and organized before you apply it to your writing. Second, the Paramedic method works to make your writing more clear and concise. Conciseness, however, does not mean you should write only short sentences. It means every word in the sentence is doing something. Once you're sure every word is doing a job, you may then need to edit for sentence variety and emphasis. That aspect of writing helps keep the reader's attention. Finally, you must always consider your audience when editing. The Paramedic method points out certain things about our writing that can make it longer or read clunky, but for certain audiences or context, those particular moves are considered appropriate. I'll try to point out some of these variations when we reach them in the video. Here is a summary of the first part of the Paramedic method. It does include other steps, but they move us into other aspects of writing besides editing. If you'd like to read more about them, I strongly recommend you pick up Richard Lanham's book, Revising Prose. The rest of this video will apply these principles to a sample text. I recommend you do these edits with me. You can get a copy of the sample paragraph I'm going to be working with, either in the video's description, or, if you're in one of my classes, from our course website. Pause the video until you have a copy. Okay, you should have a copy with you now, so let's get to work. Here's the first sentence in that 4-sentence paragraph. A study was conducted by the Secretary of the Department in order to determine the quantity and content of various internet-based websites which participate in the commerce of selling essays which could be presented by students as their own work. Okay, that is way too long and way too clunky. You may have heard it as I read it, that I kept having to stop to breathe. So let's apply the Paramedic method to this sentence so we're conveying the same ideas, but using fewer words and making sure every word is doing everything. Our first step in the Paramedic method is to circle the prepositions. Now, prepositions are modifier words that indicate a relationship between different parts of a sentence, and the kind of relationship usually deals with location, direction, and time. Prepositions create phrases that allow us writers to provide more information about a topic. However, if we use too many of them in a row, we can confuse readers. There are too many connections for them to keep straight. You can find lists of prepositions online, but here's a table that contains some of the most common ones. Now, one thing I want to make clear before we go on. These words only act as prepositions if they are followed by a noun, creating a prepositional phrase. Most words that can act as prepositions can also perform other jobs in a sentence. For example, down is a common preposition that I don't have listed on this chart. In the sentence, he fell down the stairs, it acts as a preposition. Down is followed by stairs. In the sentence, he fell down, it's doing a different job. It's still acting as a modifier, but it's not a prepositional phrase. Okay, so let's go back to the sentence. Identify the prepositions in this sentence. I'll give you about 10 seconds to do so, though you can pause the video if you need more time. Okay, I bolded the prepositions in the sentence. As you can see, there's a lot in here, and we have a really long chain of them in the first 2 lines of the sentence. This could easily confuse a reader, as they won't be able to tell which words are related. So we'll want to edit out some of these prepositional phrases. You may be wondering why I didn't bold the to in the second line. Notice that it's followed by determine, which is a verb, not a noun. In this case, to is serving a different function than a preposition. Okay, so the next step of the Paramedic method asks us to circle the is forms. Specifically, those are the verbs listed on the screen. Is, are, was, were, am, be, been, and to be. These words are among the most commonly used English verbs. They're also the weakest. They essentially say that the subject word of the clause just exists, and that doesn't really convey any action, so it can either bore readers or confuse them. The Paramedic method has us pay attention to these verbs because they also can create a situation called passive voice. Let's take a bit of time to talk about what passive voice is and how it compares to active voice. Voice tells us how the verb interacts with whatever word is in the subject position of the clause. In passive voice, that word is acted on. Look at the example given in the screen. Mr. Body is in the subject position, but he was killed by someone else. So therefore, this sentence is in passive voice. In active voice, whatever word is in the subject position performs the action indicated by the verb. The active voice example on the screen puts the murder in the subject position. As you can see, passive voice often requires readers to add extra words to a sentence, which can make the sentence harder for readers to process. In addition, passive voice allows writers to eliminate whoever or whatever performs the action, and this can sometimes create deceptive communication. You may be thinking that passive voice is always bad. I am not trying to imply that. Remember that I said earlier in the video that you may have to make editing choices based on your audience and context. There are some audiences and contexts that prefer passive voice. Now, passive voice is appropriate when the object being acted on is more important than the actor. So think about scientific genres like lab reports. They use passive voice all the time because in that case, the experiments should lead to the same results regardless of who does them. What matters is not who does the experiment, but what the results are. You may also not want to name the agent or know who the agent is. Think about newspaper articles that may be reporting crimes. Often they won't name the criminal either because the police haven't caught him yet or the criminal's identity needs to be protected. Both of these situations are appropriate uses of passive voice. Finally, we need is forms when the subject is restated or defined later in the clause. For example, the sentence, "I am a professor," uses an is form, but I work as a professor. So professor is restating who I am. In this case, the is form acts like an equal sign in a math equation, saying that what exists on one side of it is equal to what's on the other side. Now, I've done this digression into passive voice because I wanted to be sure that you just didn't edit it out blindly. If you're a student who's in a chemistry class writing a lab report, using active voice will probably cause you to get a lower grade. Always remember, writing requires us to think about our choices and to make the best one for the rhetorical situation. Okay, so let's get back to our sentence. Here's the sentence we've been editing, and the prepositions are still bolded. Take a few moments to identify the is forms. Remember, you're looking for words like is, are, was, were, be, been, and to be. I'll give you about 10 seconds to do this, though you can pause the video if you need to take more time. Okay, so I've underlined the is forms in this sentence, and it contains two, both of which are acting as our main verbs. As I said earlier, is forms don't imply any action, which causes them to get buried under the weight of nouns. An overload of nouns combined with too many prepositional phrases can make a sentence much harder to read. We'll want to work on recasting the sentence so that we eliminate some of these elements without losing the core meaning we want to convey. The next step in the paramedic method is to ask, where's the action, or who's kicking who? This step reminds us that verbs convey action, so we need to make sure they're strong and specific. Often, a sentence's action can be hidden in certain types of nouns or adjectives called nominalizations. Nominalizations are words that probably started out in history as verbs, but then they were changed to act as nouns or modifiers. To find nominalizations, look for words ending in the suffixes listed on the screen. tion, sion, ment, ence, ance, and ing. These will often be nominalizations. Okay. Nominalizations are often longer words, and that can make them harder for readers to process. For example, utilization is a 4-syllable way of saying use. In most cases, the 1-syllable word works better. Now notice that I said in most cases. Nominalizations are not always a bad choice. For example, the names of many professions, like actor, are nominalizations of the verb that profession has people do. These type of nominalizations are part of language, and they're frequently a more concise way of expressing an idea. In addition, some disciplines use nominalization to define important concepts. Remember, any edits need to be appropriate for the particular audience, purpose, and context you're working in. So let's go back to the sentence we've been working on and see if we can find any hidden actions. So I've italicized some words that could work as actions. I need to think about now what the sentence is trying to convey in order to determine what the true action is. Then, the next step of the paramedic method the next step of the paramedic method, tells us what to do with that action. And that step is to place the action in a simple, not compound verb. Now, Lanham doesn't seem to specify in revising prose exactly what he means by simple. I think he means one word. Okay. Before we move on, I do want to add an important rejoinder. There are some verb tenses that require us to use multiple words to express the tense. So if you're writing about an event in the future, you generally have to add will or shall before the verb. That's fine because those auxiliaries are necessary. Lanham just wants us to avoid verbs that aren't. Choosing a simple verb requires us to be aware of the different flavors of verb, the connotations they can convey. Think about news headlines about sports. Saying Team A lost to Team B and Team B crushed Team A do not convey the same connotation, even if a dictionary says they mean basically the same thing. Let's go back to our sentence and see what we can move to create a simple verb. Okay, and at this point, I may go slightly off of my script, so I'm going to try to stay focused, but if I seem kind of rambly, it's because I'm thinking through my edits. And I think it's important for y'all to see me doing that thinking. So, give me a second to reread this sentence and try to figure out what the most important action is. Okay, so I think the most important action is that there's research being done here. And we can convey that idea by making study into a verb. Now, doesn't have any of the endings that we saw with anomalization. But if you're a student, you definitely know study is a verb. Okay? So now we have to think about who conducted the study. That would be the secretary. Okay? He or she would then get moved to the subject position, changing the sentence from passive to active voice. And we no longer need was conducted. Okay? So let's see what that looks like. Okay? So here's a rewrite that makes study a verb and puts the secretary in the subject position. And that takes care of the main clause. But there's also a dependent clause later in the sentence. It's the part that reads, which could be presented by students as their own work. The clause uses could be presented as its verb, which is a passive construction. Can you think of ways to make that clause, the clause I just read, into active voice with a simple verb? In this case, it's an easy change. If we make students the subject of the clause, we can change the verb to the active voice could present. We need the could because the sentence doesn't say all students are cheating. It says some might. So we need something in there to let us know that this is a conditional situation. Okay. So the last step of the paramedic method that we're going to cover tells us to start fast with no slow windups. In revising prose, Lanham specifically talks about a kind of sentence construction known as an expletive construction. This pattern displaces the subject later in the sentence. In English, the most common expletive constructions are forms of is that or there is. In most cases, we can cut everything up to those words and not lose any meaning. This is also the step where we look for other forms of repetition or redundancy that aren't necessary. For example, think about the expression red in color. Red is a color, so saying in color is redundant. Okay? I'll point out several examples of redundant language as we work through the remaining sentences. Okay, so let's go back to our sentence. Now this one doesn't contain any there is or there at is that constructions. However, it does contain some redundancies we can trim. Secretary of the department can easily be recast to department secretary. Okay, because that's a very common construction, and of the department just shifts a modifier later in the sentence and adds two words that we don't need. Okay. Similarly, most websites exist on the internet, so I don't think we need to say internet-based. Okay, so now things are going to start to get tricky. The quality and content of various internet-based websites which participate in the commerce of selling essays is important information, so it needs to show up in the sentence somehow. We just don't need to use that many words. Various and quantity are both similar terms, so we can probably cut one of them. The rest of the phrase could be recast to emphasize the most important idea about these sites, that they sell essays to students, which the students can then present as their own work. After all, commerce means to sell. Making that change leads to the following sentence. The department secretary studied the content of various websites which sell students essays they can present as their own work. Now this version is much more concise, and I feel like it's keeping the original's meaning. Also notice this isn't a simple sentence. It still is giving us a complicated structure, and it wouldn't be out of place in any piece of writing done by an adult. Okay? It's just easier to read. So we're going to spend the rest of this video working through the remaining sentences in the paragraph. And I'm going to try to pick up the pace a little bit now because I think you have a grasp of the basic principles of the paramedic method. However, seeing additional applications will increase that understanding. So here's the second sentence in that paragraph. See if you can identify the prepositions and the is forms. I'll give you 10 seconds to do that, but you can pause the video if you want to take more time. Okay, so I bolded the prepositions again and underlined the is forms. Okay, like sentence 1, this sentence uses is forms for all of the main verbs. It also sort of adds a lot of prepositional phrases to the end where the writer seems to be trying to sort of really explain the point. So we'll need to think about ways of keeping that information while reducing the number of words. Now see if you can identify the kicking words, those words that contain concrete actions. I'll give you 10 seconds to find them, though you can pause the video to give yourself more time. Okay, so I've italicized words that contain actions, and we've got several options here: determined, possession, correspondence, and used. We're going to need to work through which ones are the most important and then figure out who or what is performing each one. So now let me talk through how I would edit this. So given the sentence's overall focus, I think determined is the main verb. However, the sentence doesn't seem to contain a subject for that verb, and this is something that can happen with passive voice. We don't know who did the determining. Okay, in this case, we can use context to help us. The previous sentence tells us the secretary did the research, so I assume he or she made the determination. We can add them to the sentence as the main clause's subject. Doing this allows us to cut is that, which is one of the constructions Lanham told us to avoid. Possession is the nominalization of possess. Now, who's doing the possessing? Okay, the sites, which makes them the agent. If we say these sites possessed, we can remove of and just make essays an object. This edit takes out several words. Correspondence is a nominalization of correspond. In this case, that would work as a subject, since that stands in for the essays. Okay, I've just talked through how we'd apply step 4. Let's see what it would actually look like. Okay, first, the secretary determined that many of these sites possess essays that corresponded to assignments used by a large number of faculty. Okay, we haven't lost any meaning, and we've got a more compact sentence. You may notice that these edits take out thing. I felt it was a redundancy in the previous sentence, and the same idea is conveyed by the material on lines 2 and 3 here. You may also be thinking that corresponded is a multisyllabic way of saying matched. That's true, and you can certainly use match here without changing the meaning. However, if we're using Lanham's definition of a simple verb, corresponded fits, so I decided to just keep it here. The next step is start fast, no slow windups. What remaining redundant or unnecessary words or phrases do you see in this sentence? I'll give you about 10 seconds to think about it. Okay, we cut a lot, so I only really see one unnecessary set word left by a large number of faculty. A large number means the same thing as most, so we can swap those 3 words for 1. If we do that, we also reduce the 2 prepositional phrases in the sentence to 1. Let's see what my edited version of sentence 2 looks like. First, the secretary determined that many of these sites possess essays that corresponded to assignments used by most faculty. Okay, this edit is more concise. I don't think it loses any meaning from the original. And again, you may have used different words, and that's perfectly fine. What's more important that you get out of this video is that you understand the principles. Okay, let's move on to the next sentence in the paragraph. Okay, so now I'm going to give you about 15 seconds to identify the preposition, is forms, and hidden actions in this sentence. Of course, feel free to pause the video if you need more time. Now the bolding, underline, and italicizing shows us we have a lot to do in order to get the sentence more concise. So let's get started on it. Let's start with the is-was opening. Lanham tells us this is an empty opener, so we can construct it and start with decided. It's a simple verb, so we can probably keep it. So we have to now figure out who's doing the deciding, who's performing that action. Again, we can go back to context to figure this out. The previous two sentences talk about the secretary and the faculty. Now, it's more likely that the faculty are going to create assignments for their classes than the secretary, so they're the agent here. They made this decision, so decided is the main verb. They're also the ones who will have to modify their assignments, so they may remain an agent for the next clause. To reduce redundancy, let's use they as the agent for would modify. At this point, the edited sentence reads, the faculty decided they would modify their assignments. Now we're into the second clause. This one's going to require a lot more restructuring because it contains two subordinate clauses. That students were required to provide a draft, and that topics should be changed to be less generic in style. I don't like the way this reads as it's organized, so I'm going to sort of flop these clauses and put the second one before the first. Okay. Now I can do this because of the and. And tells us that these two ideas are linked and they're equal, so we can just move them around. Okay. Making this change also allows us to replace in such a way with so. Okay. So let's isolate the second half of the sentence so we can look at it more clearly. Okay, so let's start our edits with the clause that topics would be changed to be less generic in style. Modify and change mean the same thing, so we don't need both of them. I'll cut change just because I think modify sounds better. We wouldn't then need to be, so it can be cut too. Similarly, generic implies a certain style, so we can cut in style. That would leave us with that topics would be less generic. You may be wondering why I left the is verb here. In this case, it's acting as an equal sign, linking the modifier generic to topic. So we're going to need that particular verb in order to convey the same meaning as the original. Let's move to the second clause. That students would be required to provide a draft at an earlier point in their process. The italics shows us several possible actions. Luckily, the agent is already in place, students. So what are the students doing? Providing a draft. We need to make sure to keep the idea that students have to do this, but we can make required into an adjective modifying draft. Now for the rest of the clause. At an earlier point. Okay, that means the same thing as earlier. So let's swap out that prepositional phrase for one word, and we're not losing any meaning. Okay, so I've talked through a lot here. Let's see what this actually looks like when we combine it with the rest of the sentence. The faculty decided to modify their assignments so that topics were less generic and so that students would submit a required draft earlier in the process. Okay, this edit's shorter. I don't think it loses any meaning. I'll admit I don't like the way it sounds. I think it sounds really clunky. However, we can work on the style in future edits. So our main goal here is to just make sure we're being concise, and we've done that. So we've got one more sentence in this paragraph to edit. Here it is. Okay. So let's walk through the paramedic method one more time using this sentence to do so. So I'll give you 15 seconds to mark the prepositions, is forms, and words hiding in action. And as usual, if you need to take more time, pause the video. Okay, so here's everything marked. We got fewer prepositions here, but we still have a lot of is verbs and hidden actions. So it is represents one of Lanham's empty openers. So we can cut it and replace it with an agent, the faculty. That edit reduces the opening clause to the faculty hoped. That can often be cut from sentences such as the one we've constructed without losing meaning. And I think we can make that edit here. So we can say the faculty hope these modifications. Now the rest of these sentence contains a lot of redundant information. For example, students are those attending an educational institution, so we don't need that phrase. It's just unnecessarily redundant. Similarly, we can condense behavior that is considered inappropriate to inappropriate behavior. We're changing that that is considered inappropriate, that clause, into just a modifying word. Okay, and we're saying the same thing, but with fewer words. Okay, so here's my edited version of the fourth sentence. They hoped these modifications would reduce the chances students would engage in inappropriate behavior. It's more concise, while still conveying the same meaning, and we still have a complex structure. So let's look at this whole paragraph. Okay. Now, this paragraph, I feel, contains the same information as the original, but it expresses the information in much fewer words. Okay, every syllable in here is doing something. There's no wasted words. Now, if you've been doing this along with me, you may have come up with other edits for the paragraph, and that's perfectly fine. My goal in this video hasn't been to show you the only one true way to edit a text. It's been to demonstrate a series of principles that you can apply to edit any text so that your writing is more clear and concise. Now, it's your turn to apply them. Hope you have a good time editing.